The Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art is an artist and audience-centered institution that brings communities together under the shared philosophy that art has the power to engage our imaginations, challenge our perceptions, and inspire change. Opened in 1999 and located in Scottsdale, Arizona, the museum has established itself as a leader in the arts, presenting innovative exhibitions and educational programs. SMOCA engages with emerging and established artists from around the world and from our own community to support new commissions and encourage dialogue about the art of our time. The result is a lively community space that is a laboratory for creative thinking and new ideas. By embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion as organizational values, SMOCA, together with creatives across platforms, promotes cross-cultural dialogue and fosters mutual understanding and respect. We hope you have the chance to visit SMOCA soon.
So I would like to welcome everyone to this special discussion hosted by SMOCA in conjunction with the exhibition Diedrich Bracken's Arc of Bulrushes. My name is Keisha Turley, and as one of the organizers for this program, it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce the wonderful guests who have taken the time to join us here today. We have Beth Collier, Wild in the City, who will be leading our discussion today. Dauntless environmentalist and activist Derrick Evans, and Frederick Tutman, environmentalist, advocate, educator, and the riverkeeper of his home river, the Patuxent in Chesapeake, Maryland. We're honored to have them here with us to discuss and expand on the important topics that were introduced in the film Come Hell or High Water, The Battle for Turkey Creek. And Beth, why don't you start us off with an introduction?
Hi, thanks very much, Keshia. My name is Beth Collier. I'm the founder director of Wild in the City, a UK-based organisation supporting people of colour to enjoy and access countryside in the UK. Traditionally, our presence has been confined to more urban areas, and there's been a legacy of generational loss of knowledge, which our organisation is helping to rebuild an oral tradition back into learning about nature and the natural world through family, through community. I'm also an ethnographer, and I've done a lot of in-depth research about people of colour's relationship with nature in the UK and the reasons why we tend to spend less time in natural settings compared to white communities. I'm also a nature-allied psychotherapist, and I help people explore their relationship, not just their human social relationship, but their relationship with the natural world. And sessions take place in nature, working in allegiance with nature to help us explore our emotional worlds. I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks very much.
Derrick, do you want to continue next with an introduction?
Sure. I'm Derrick Evans, a sixth-generation native of the Turkey Creek community and watershed of coastal Mississippi, which is located about an hour east of New Orleans, Louisiana, and an hour west of Mobile, Alabama, among other things, which is Hurricane Alley, part of one of this country's maybe biggest energy sacrifice zones, and one of the most human and environmentally over-engineered or altered places in North America for a long time. And I returned home, of course, from Boston, Massachusetts about 20 years ago to contribute my voice and whatever resources that I could muster to help prevent cultural and environmental displacement in my community, and then ultimately in similarly situated communities, particularly along the Gulf coastal plain of the United States. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. And Fred, certainly not last but certainly not least, if you could introduce yourself as well.
Sure, I'm Fred Tutman. I founded Patuxent Riverkeeper, the organization I now run, back in 2004. You know, we're very community-based, and our work largely involves empowering the communities that we touch. Every and all people are welcome, but I think we've been particularly effective in embracing and connecting ourselves to people of color, communities who are often not taken into consideration by wider movements that simply assume that either we're not interested because we're not interested in the same things that those movements are typically interested in, or where I do think that there's a boycott occurring, a boycott in the sense that people of color stay away from those other movements where they're an afterthought or an asterisk or a footnote. So I think we've actually been through the looking glass on this whole thing that they call diversity, but it's kind of a term I sort of reject, right? It's kind of a patronizing term. And in fact, we're a very inclusive and 360-degree movement in terms of whom we speak for in these watersheds, whom we connect to, whom we serve. There it is.
Thank you so much. Now I will turn it over to Beth to begin some of our wonderful discussion and thought. And I'll open it up to her.
Great, thank you. Well, what a powerful film. Thank you, Derrick and Leah, for telling a story, a fight for recognition, justice, and the protection of humanity, culture, and the environment. Environmental justice speaks of a simultaneous threat to our needs as humans and the needs of the natural world. And the film demonstrated so clearly how race and poverty are used to dismiss the need for the care or preservation of natural settings and the habitats that we call home for the benefits of human health and biodiversity. Black and brown people and those on low incomes face additional oppression in having to fight for our needs to be seen as valid. Come Hell or High Water raises many powerful themes, many of which are common throughout Africa and the diaspora. For example, environmental racism and economic exclusion, both of which are common within Black experiences of environmental oppression and the fight for justice. Our needs matter less, we're less important. For an overview of other commonalities affecting people of African descent, you can see a statement on systemic and pervasive racism in the environmental field, which is hosted on the Sierra Club, Audubon Society, or Wild in the City website. In our conversation today, we'll be exploring Black relationships with nature and the ways in which, in some cases, we've become disenfranchised from the natural world, and consider the challenges in being a Black environmental activist and the impact of environmental racism on our ability to participate in caring for and enjoy the world. Well, for me, within the film, I thought that one of the most aggressive assaults towards Black people was the power taken through white supremacy in denying the Black lived experience of not just dismissing Black perspectives and the validity of sites of importance to Black people, but also outright denying the existence of Black people in a space. The community were dumb bastards and obstructionists. It didn't occur to the councillor that the community existed in Turkey Creek. The message from white power holders was, "You are less than," to the point of not existing to me. And this weaponization of denial was also leveled at nature, the developers stating that there were no wetlands. Denial is used as a means to justify not having to respect or consider other human beings. It's a terrifying mindset. There were several instances in the film of white supremacy denying the existence of Black people in a wildlife setting or demonizing our presence there. And more widely, particularly in the environmental field, there are often connotations that we don't belong in nature. So Fred, Derrick, my first question to you is, what is the impact on Black people and our connection with nature in being told that we don't belong, we shouldn't exist in these spaces?
So I'll say, first and foremost, I have learned really that the best frame for me, anyway, to examine this subject is really through the frame of decolonization. The same way that Columbus came to these shores and started slapping names on things and staking a claim on stuff. And the environmental space is often claimed by white people who simply assume that they're the smartest people in the room. They know all the stuff. They're insiders, these insider movements essentially that occur. And so our activism is kind of indiscernible to them because our stories sometimes tend to compete with their sense of entitlement. If our story is not about them or about the things that are familiar to them, and we don't have a lot of time here to unpack a lot of this stuff, but I've run into this in so many places and spaces where there's simply a presumption that our environment is the same as the one that white activists are fighting for, when in fact we actually have, I think, a richer basis sometimes, certainly to the extent that certain local communities are involved, where we're invested in those communities, where we're from those communities. I can't imagine a place where people of color can go and start bossing other people around about their environment. So there's a question of space and domain and decolonization. You really can't have this conversation until you take the colonialism out of it. You have to go and unpack that in order to have the vocabulary to really talk about these issues on terms where people of color can be ourselves, essentially.
Yeah. What would you say have been the impact of colonization of natural settings in the environmental field on Black people and the way in which we use or navigate these spaces?
Well, sure, we don't feel safe. We don't feel welcome in many cases. When I walk on the Appalachian Trail, a place where I've been working on the same trail maintenance crew for 25 years, white people invariably ask me how I got there, as though I need to have a reason, an alibi. What brought you here? As though somehow I'm in a place where I don't really belong, or where I encounter whites on the trail who encourage me to walk in front of them because I don't know that they want a strange Black man walking behind them on the trail. It has a very different kind of connotation, I think, for folks. So I do think we're really not always made to feel welcome, but also we're also not made to feel as though we're really stakeholders, that we're a means towards someone else's end, right? Our utility to these conservation movements is that we supply them with diversity, not necessarily leadership, great ideas, ingenuity, passion, all of the stuff that we have that is of note and worthwhile. I think these movements, quite frankly, desperately need us. They really need our passion and our energy and our perspective. But it's tough. It's a tough argument or a tough conversation to have where there's a presumption that it's claimed space already and we're junior or subordinate, or again, that word, diversity.
Thanks, Fred. Derrick.
Yeah, I am an advocate of when it is possible, and in most cases it's not, unfortunately, because it's so systemic and globally pandemic and permanently so in many ways. But when it is possible, I look for ways to completely flip the script. I have at times reminded people of the old, the African proverb, I think it's an African proverb, that says that when the lion tells the story of the hunt, it will look and sound different. And there's no doubt about that. But I've given that some more thought, and I've decided that the first and most important story that the lion must tell is the story that the lion tells to herself or himself about where am I, what is not at my disposal, what is at my disposal, and how am I going to survive and how am I going to then prevail and then tell the story. And that is in sync with, what I'm very proud of and what I rely on a lot, which is the wisdom and the lessons of our slave ancestors, who for 14 generations before the US Civil War understood and recognized, I think, in many instances, that the first and most important form of resistance was to survive. And empower in ways that were possible, and particularly through the oral tradition and through storytelling. And I think of, you know, the Brer Rabbit and the Brer Fox tales, and Nancy, the spider in the West Indies, where I'm proud to say that my ancestors found ways where there was no way to navigate, right, the you know, to the best and fullest extent possible by any human being or community of humans. One of the longest and deepest and worst crimes against humanity, if not the worst, you know, in recorded, you know, history. And my mother is one who adds to that sort of pedagogy, if you will, right, of the lion's story to the lion's self and the lion den, and Brer Rabbit, of course, and these stories of the underdog being so familiar with their own circumstances and the nature of the overdog to prevail in instances, maybe not broadly, you know, completely revolutionarily, but to prevail nonetheless when and where possible, and to further fight another day. And my mother adds to that, or has added to that with me for years, when she says, Derrick, when people make a circle that excludes you or excludes us, and or even includes you in some way that you don't want to be included, you've got to try to figure out a way to make a bigger circle. Forces them to include themselves in that circle. So I say this as sort of a preface or a pretext to what I guess I basically do in Turkey Creek and in Roxbury in Massachusetts and elsewhere, is find opportunities and ways to invert that predictable, systemic, culturally embedded stuff against itself. For example, there was a episode of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart that Fred has seen, where, you know, the fact is I'm in Mississippi, you know, we're trying to advocate for an African-American community and an environment in a country, in a state that is akin to, you know, really, I mean, it's not pejorative in this sense to say a third world nation, right? I mean, they passed a law in 2003 making it illegal to bribe a judge, okay, in Mississippi. So it's a very kind of interesting place, okay? And it always has been. You know, Nina Simone sang Mississippi Goddamn. I mean, and other folks during the civil rights movement said, you know, it was the deepest and most challenging focus area, right, of the civil rights movement. It still has those legacies, and they're not legacies, they're current facts of life. But I realized that it was slowly evolving to become a significant place for both not tourists, but local people to engage in bird watching. And Turkey Creek, I discovered, just so happened to be the last or first freshwater and berries that birds could ingest and rest up during their, you know, biannual or, you know, twice a year migrations to Central America and back to North America. And it was a so-called birding trap. So I was like, well, it's kind of like Freedom Summer in 1964, where they said, let's bring down some volunteers, mostly white volunteers, to the Mississippi Delta to help make visible, right, the invisible, more egregious oppression of Black folk in Mississippi. And so the birds became like Freedom Summer volunteers for me. And because essentially I made friends with folks in Audubon who then become advocates for protecting the wetlands in Turkey Creek. And quite frankly, it doesn't matter to me whether they go full course or full circle. My job is to stop the bleeding in Turkey Creek. And I know that it's going to take an eclectic mix of people, or what my mother calls a bigger circle. So that was the story that this lion told himself in my den about where we are, what we do have in our hands to help mandate a future. Because at the end of the day, I don't care what the circumstances are. I'm an African-American descendant of African-American slaves in Mississippi, and I am proud to be. And because I know that I am, it's more of an assurance that African-American slaves won't descend from me.
Knowing that story.
Right, I value those things. And the bottom line here is, it's like they say, some people would say, don't despair, don't lose hope. My thing is self-determination is got to always be on the table. And it's not just a matter of not being at the table and therefore being on the menu. No, you got to set the table, or you'll be a guest in your own house.
Thanks, Derrick. A noticeable part of your campaigning was the impact on your ability to earn an income and your health and well-being. And being in touch with Black practitioners and activists in the States, the UK and Africa, I know there's a commonality around Black practitioners and organisations being underfunded and often having to work for free to get the job done. So there's a story of economic exclusion within the environmental field. How has economic exclusion impacted your organisation, your work? And more generally, how does this impact Black participation in environmental projects and activism? Derrick, do you want to start?
Well, it's a mixed bag because, you know, it takes resources to do this work. Of course, you know, if you saw the film, I had my own resources and therefore latitude for years in Turkey Creek, but the scale, right, and the growing scale of the battle and the required activities to help save Turkey Creek was overwhelming, and ultimately nearly cost me everything: health, wealth, and sanity. At the same time, the financial contributions of others, i.e. environmental grant makers, whoever, whoever has coin to contribute or not to this struggle, it's a mixed bag, because although it's needed, the resources are needed, you know, rare are the resources that come with no strings attached. You know, maybe that's why one of the other reasons they call them purse strings. I don't know. But, you know, some money you don't want. And I don't just mean like from some big corporation that's greenwashing, you know, like some petrochemical corporation, what have you. But I mean, folks who don't value or understand or prioritize the whole list of values, objectives, concerns, things that are in someone like Fred or my mind's eye. Do you really want them in the kitchen sometimes when you're cooking up the stew? Because that's not what they're for. And if they think in any way that that is part of what they're for. I had a mentor once who said that she had plenty of well-to-do, mostly white, well-to-do friends. And she goes, but I don't have any of them to cook for their ideas. You know, she goes, I got my own ideas. I got plenty to do with my and our ideas and goals and values and objectives. Frankly, she said, and they know it because she tells them, or told them when she was living, that I value your friendship, but be very clear. it's a very large part of it has to do with the resources that you can help bring to bear on what I care, what your friend who is me cares about. And be careful of ever thinking or overthinking that it's, it's your ideas or your general thrust or where you think things are going or ought to be going.
Thanks, Derrick. Fred, how about you? How has your work been impacted by economic exclusion?
I know for a fact that the resources that might be available to a wider organization have never been made available to Patuxent Riverkeeper. And in many instances, we have stopped asking because we got tired of being censured by, evaluated by, and judged by these funders who don't really know us and don't really want to take the time to look into the particulars of what we really do, which tends to be very locally accountable. Mostly money does come with directives, things you can't do with the funders' money. And we are very responsive to local communities. We really are a grassroots movement. So sometimes top-down funding is sort of incompatible with what we're trying to do. But on other occasions, it's corrective in intent. I know from over almost going on 20 years, I'm the longest serving waterkeeper in the Chesapeake Bay area. There are about 19 waterkeepers here, most of them heavily funded by corporate money and foundation money. And we are a movement that really picks up the struggle of these local communities. I don't know of any grants that will pay you to struggle. Mostly, they'll pay you to do stuff that is complementary to the establishment or very narrow. Pick up the trash or plant some trees or do something related to stewardship. Fighting to make transformative change in unjust systems is in fact revolutionary work. And I don't know any revolutionaries who expect to get a steady paycheck. It's just the nature of the game. I don't think these wider movements understand that because they have become career endeavors for them. And it's a great place to build a career if you're white, because there's the expectation there that the white folks are the most likely environmentalists. In fact, until I think Black environmentalism is the norm in any of these organizations, they will never really truly be integrated organizations. They will always be places where we're kind of an add-on or extra thing, or, first hired, last, first fired, last hired. I don't think these movements understand that. I think for the most part, they think they can sprinkle some people of color on their efforts and call it a day, because it shows that they have the authority to speak on behalf of people of color. And the truth is, I don't care if they do or they don't. I don't really care if they fund us anymore. In some cases, I don't really want their money. What I want is to have the voice that we represent on behalf of these communities, unchallenged by these movements that purport to speak for everyone. And they don't. They really don't have the moral authority. They don't even have the physical mass to really do that. We wouldn't be talking to some of these institutions if they didn't have free money to give away, because their expertise is rather limited on the issues we work on. So they have to understand that the money controls money-oriented movements. Money doesn't control activism, not at least in Patuxent Riverkeeper. So that's about as fine a point as I can put on it. It's a deep well, and it's something that deserves a lot more conversation generally, because I don't know many white institutions that think the money controls them. I think they have money because they're swell. They're wonderful organizations. We do great work. Of course, people shower us with money. Actually, it's a little more complicated than that.
Beth, and I want to make sure that you also have a chance to speak to your experience, since it's, it's the same, but also slightly different because you're in another country from the UK.
Okay, yes, yeah. I can speak to my experience in the UK, particularly post BLM movement and George Floyd's murder in 2020. We've seen a huge demand and interest in our services and our programs, but this hasn't translated into additional funding that could help us increase our capacity to meet that demand. So we've actually been in the perverse situation of having increased interest, but actually having to contemplate closure because we don't have the capacity. And this has been a historic problem. I'm now 8 years working full-time, unsalaried, with no intention to be a martyr and to do this work for free, but continually chasing carrots and pink elephants. Our history has been a bit like you're saying, Fred, in terms of funding, being viewed in a particularly negative way as a Black-led organisation, and all sorts of assumptions made about us by funders, but very much the view of funders and the wider environmental field that we will somehow struggle with a technical incompetency in writing funding bids, in being able to evidence funding bids. And there's been very little attention on the attitudes of funders towards Black organisations, our needs and our methods. And for me, this is something that as more mainstream NGOs have been interested in increasing diversity in their organisations, this is something that's been left behind, is exploring what have been the attitudes of funders and policymakers towards Black institutions. So having failed to attract funding from grant-giving bodies, we focused on consultation, drawing in particular from our research expertise around people of colour's engagement with nature and the natural world. But what we find is we have approaches from organisations who are very interested in us offering in-depth insight and knowledge, helping us to design programs, helping us to populate services. But they expect us to do this for free as a chat over coffee. When we ask, what's the brief, what's the timeline, do you have a budget, we tend to not hear from them again. So it's really hard to find a model to sustain ourselves independently, that in effect we're excluded from participating and having a seat at the table because we don't have access to funds. But yet this lack of access to funds is used to further make a claim or statement about competence. As you were saying, Fred, a lot of organisations think they have funds just because they're great, rather than realising that there's a wider systemic issue about who does and doesn't get funding. So yeah, it's been a very difficult year for us. We are still continuing, but we really struggle with the capacity to meet the demand, and it's quite a perverse situation to be in. And with that demand is a high level of respect for our services, but the respect or the valuing the nature of the work we do, but it isn't valued in monetarily, and that's a real problem for us.
But we can always get grants for training. As the most experienced waterkeeper in the Chesapeake after 20 years, I can always pass the hat and find some money for more training, as though somehow we're just kind of, interns.
Yeah. Yeah. Very infantilizing attitude, yes, that we're somehow incompetent or at a beginning stage of our career or journey. Yeah.
Well, the small organizations are ones that just haven't learned to be big. See, I like being a small organization. I feel very accountable. I feel very accessible to those communities we serve. I'm not interested in getting to be a mega green by any shape or form. But I do think those capitalist values are built into these movements that are, by their very nature, top down. They leave very little wiggle room in terms of what you can do with that money, given that it has a top-down source.
Yeah.
So I like being funded by the communities. They make my life much easier in terms of whom I answer to and what my marching orders are. And I feel morally authentic. I don't feel like I'm stepping on anyone's toes,
I think that's priceless, isn't it? That sense of integrity in being accountable to people that are benefiting from your services, and being able to follow means and methods that work for the people that you're serving. Yeah, rather than that pressure to operate in a way that ticks boxes but is quite meaningless to the people you're working with.
That's right.
Yeah, it liberates our voice. Actually, we can fight some fights, particularly because we're not funded by the establishment. I don't know that people really understand that sometimes. Like, we can say some of the stuff we say publicly simply because we're not invested in the system. It cuts the other way too. We're also not necessarily invested in the outcomes that other Greens want done, because it wasn't our idea. We didn't sign on the dotted line. We weren't on the petition. We're really independent of that establishment. And I think we have no interest in deferring to these other movements. We give no ground, we give no quarter.
And that's another consequence of this adherence to integrity, which I wouldn't stop, but it does mean you can be poor.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a consequence.
Right.
Derek, were you going to follow on?
No, I just thought of my mother, you know, saying, you monetarily poor, and that's fine if you're not poor in the other ways, including integrity. And you know, to the, again, I say self-determination. I mean, even self-determination to me doesn't mean that you can achieve everything that you can imagine or that should be done to right wrongs and to create a sustainable, permanent, holistic solution to a very, very sick set of circumstances. That's global, national, regional, and local. But what it means instead is what Fred and Beth are saying, which is, you know, you can have the wealth, and frankly, sometimes the unrivaled wealth of autonomy and integrity and reach into places that no one else can go, not even Star Trek.
Okay, well, following on from this point about resources, I mean, a remarkable part of your story, Derek, is the perseverance. And I know in your work as well, Fred, over a couple of decades, often our journeys are long and this can take a toll. In lieu of economic resources, what energizes and supports your activism?
I think there's a spiritual quotient that comes with this work. I feel like I've got the wind at my back much of the time, and the energy that comes from the communities we interact with. We're really planting seeds. I feel like we're creating work that the community owns that will continue beyond our tenure, which does have a sense of legacy attached to it. So a good friend of mine, now deceased, very much he was influenced by Native American lore. He told me, if something's troubling you, if you're really getting down, he would say, go to the river and talk to her. He would always use the feminine pronoun. There's something to that. There's something to connecting to these resources that is powerful and empowering. And I think if you're spiritually grounded to these resources you're trying to protect and to the communities you serve, it's the best job on the planet. It's the best kind of work. It's the most satisfying work I could possibly imagine. And it's work I feel increasingly confident will continue as I see young people from many walks, not just people of color, who really understand what we're talking about, who understand you have to fight these systems. You really can't just pick up the trash and plant some trees and go 9 to 5 and get a grant and expect you can build a career and somehow you're going to change the world. And moreover, that movements that are mostly white couldn't possibly change the world without our help. They really do need us if they're going to get these jobs done. And I think that's really, really important. It's white supremacist by its very assumption, if you assume that only white people or environmentalists have the right ideas, the bright ideas, and all the ingenuity. How insane is that?
Yeah. How about you, Derek? What energizes your activism?
Well, I would echo that. I think there's a very, very central spiritual component, a sustenance, if you will. There's an appetite and a sustenance, both of which don't really exist otherwise for me, you know. And so, and also, and a part of that, frankly, is what I think is one of the purposes of life, which is self-actualization, self-realization, self-actualization. That sustains me. I remember my mother saying, another one is the instructive nature of it. I remember one of the first things my mother said, and it really hit me like a ton of bricks and befuddled me, was when I had returned home. She said, Derek, be very careful. You have a lot to lose that you've accomplished and acquired. And there is, she said, quote unquote, there is no bottom to this. And I had only been home for a few weeks with Leah in my hand. And I had already realized by stumbling upon these new languages and, of environmental law and science and so on and so on, and the list of ailments that the community had. I knew that what she was saying right there was going to be sort of the thesis of the challenge, that there's no bottom to it. And I remember walking out into the yard and I'm walking around for 10, 15, 20 minutes and really contemplating on that and coming back and saying to my mother, I said, yeah, that's right. I can already tell there's no bottom nor sides. I mean, this thing keeps spreading horizontally and going deep. And this was before Katrina. This was before BP. And I said, however, we are both educators, both in spirit and in training. And if somehow, I don't know if we can save Turkey Creek or if anybody can. I mean, it's pretty bad. But if the effort to do so ends up being instructive to someone's, including ourselves, but also other people here and elsewhere, so that exactly what has happened here can't happen quite like this again, or is less likely to somewhere else, then I believe it is possible that it would have been worth it. And so it needs to be instructive. And then finally, and I'll keep it brief, victories. You got to win. I mean, something, sometime. And we do. And we do. And I remember Dr. King saying in 1966 in Chicago, it was during the same speech, I believe, when he said that those who make a nonviolent revolution impossible make a violent revolution inevitable. I believe it was that speech, and that the next line, or one of the very next lines, was, I need some victories. I need some victories. And that was him telling his audiences at the Palmer Hilton Hotel in Chicago, you need me in this movement to win some victories, to stay this course, So I think wins.
Thank you both. So we've talked about some of the ways in which Black people are disenfranchised or dispossessed from nature, but there's also incredible healing for individuals and communities in rebuilding relationships with nature. What are some of the ways you've seen healing occur?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? So I have seen people have all sorts of epiphanies in nature. I mean, like just sometimes overwhelming. I've actually seen people break out into tears just because of a recognition and that was catalyzed in nature, where nature was the catalyst. I've seen a few of those on my river. I've certainly seen them in the Grand Canyon and out in the kind of the Badlands of Utah, where you just have this sense of overwhelming antiquity. Like, my God, we don't matter much because the world is so old and so mature. And that can be pretty humbling, very centering, I think. I find generally that nature tests us. I feel this consortium, this maybe not a dialogue in the usual sense, but this give and take. Yes, and I spent much of my life kind of pursuing that experience. I want to stand on a mountaintop or swim in an ocean. I swam in a sea storm once as a boy. I never told my parents that. They would have been appalled, because I wanted to feel what that was like. And I felt it was a very personal transaction between me and nature. Nature was kicking my butt. She kept throwing me on the beach in the coral, dragging me. And it was a thing. I was in this locked in this match with nature. It was a very personal feeling that I had. So I do think nature is transformative. And by the way, that was what drew me to the Waterkeeper movement. It was the first movement where one of the founders, it was actually Bobby Kennedy Jr., said that God speaks to you in nature through whatever vector, through whatever faith. So yes, we don't go to the shopping mall for inspiration. We go to the mountaintop or the desert or the beach or some place where we can experience nature in its purest and most direct form. That's healing.
Thank you, Fred.
Um, in many ways, I feel very blessed, very fortunate to hail from not just Mississippi, but the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which of course is Hurricane Alley. And periodically, nature, the most violent storms on earth, the largest and most powerful, the hurricanes, either threaten or do in fact devastate everybody. And so in that sense, they're never long-lived enough, but there are these periods where the complete and total chaos and destruction of a storm hitting a place. I mean, in the immediate, during and after, it pretty much brings everybody together in a vulnerability, down on their knees situation where for those brief and shining moments, we see one another's humanity through different lenses. Okay, that's the one silver lining of a disaster, and it needs to be longer lived than the immediate response. And I learned some years ago that in the Caribbean, the indigenous people, the Tainos in the Caribbean, actually had a god, a deity called Huracan. And it was the Spanish who heard them use this word to describe what's now we call hurricanes. And for them, Huracan was a deity, a divine power, a very powerful force that was basically an act of creation and recreation by creating these all-impacting, powerful storms that would blow in, destroy weak and infirm as well as healthy, whatever it would, but then create and then leave, and to return, but to create new life. I mean, new species of plants, would emerge, all kinds of things in the aftermath of a hurricane. And so I remember after Hurricane Katrina, my good friend Will Skinner, who passed away a few months ago from COVID, he was a very simple man, a good man. I don't think he ever, except for a stint in Vietnam in the 70s when he was in the military, I don't think he ever spent too many hours of his life outside of Harrison County, Mississippi. But he did evacuate and went up to the next county north for Katrina. And when he came back, he told me this great short vignette. He said, Derrick, when I got back after the storm, the chickens, the dogs, and the cats, because he had them all, had gotten together up on the roof. They all come together, the chickens, the cats, and the dogs. He said, and that said something to me. And, and I think it says something about people and about, he said, I bet you those dogs and chickens and cats were telling each other, man, I'm sorry about that mess way back there where we were talking they came together. And, if it's longer lived, and permanent in case of people, I think that is one of the possible gifts and promises of nature.
That's wonderful. Yeah, there's a relationship to be had with nature and the natural world as something we're part of, but also something we can relate with.
Yes.
Thank you both for your time today. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today. There's something that really stands out for me about the importance of the work you're doing, importance of Black activism in not just the here and now, but the legacy. And I think of your ancestors, Derrick, and what they were able to pass on to subsequent generations, and also what you're passing on to generations in preserving and protecting Turkey Creek, that our wins and successes might not necessarily be today, but we're ensuring that there are opportunities for them to come tomorrow also. Any final words on optimism around Black activism? What are you hopeful for the future?
Well, you know, Beth, you were a participant, as was Derrick, in the Taking Nature Black conferences. And what a great party they have been. Conferences themed and guided by and organized by people of color, where of course everyone is welcome. But it's a better room, it's a better conversation because we're in it. And so we're going to stay involved with that kind of work and look for lots of opportunities to connect people, not only to nature, but to each other, because goodness knows this world is in a deep hurt. And we need to work together. We've got to find ways to cut through some of this foolishness that simply presumes that one group or class of people have dominion over something as critical and as important as the environment. So I'm hopeful. I wouldn't be doing this work if I was hopeless. I really am hopeful.
Great.
And I'm glad you mentioned Taking Nature Black, because for me, that was the most powerful singular opportunity that I've ever had to see the number of Black people younger than me who were working in, whether in government, academia, activism, education, you know, whatever. You wouldn't have seen that 10 years ago, I don't think. Certainly not 20, 30, 40, 50. I mean, the fact that these folks are able to choose and want to choose to do work that is significant to the environment and to their communities and to our world and nation, I think is like a good chickens coming home to roost. I think that it's like an answer to some prayers. And I feel blessed to be able to witness it in this stage of my life and going forward. That you know, folks like Fred Tutman are not just an isolated silo in the wilderness, hollering for sanity across disciplines and across everything else, like we have to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for a really insightful conversation, and thank you to our audience for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.